meet my bride. Let's go for a ride in my newfangled automobile. Just where we will go, nobody knows, but it's sure a great way to feel. Behind the wheel of the speed meter steel, it's my newfangled automobile.
Hello and welcome to Vintage Car History. I'm Wild Bill, and it has been written by many automotive historians that in late Victorian Europe, cars were the toys of the wealthy. And it's hard to argue against that. Lords and nobles from all over were somewhat intrigued by this new invention, and quite a few embraced it. Through their patronage, they were instrumental in shaping the foundation of what is today the modern European automotive industry. But how did this come about? Why were they so involved? And of course, who were the motoring monarchs? Now, just to be clear, there was a monarch in the United States of America during this era, and that was Queen Liliuokalani of Hawaii. But her reign ended in 1893, and the first car didn't get to the island for another 5 years, so we got nothing more to say about the USA today. But it is true that in Europe of the late 1890s, your typical blue-collar worker, or most white-collar ones for that matter, had neither the need nor money for a car. There are a number of reasons for this. Let's look at the need first. Europe has been crammed with various civilizations for millennia, each building upon the other. Europeans have been chopping, carving, scraping, and polishing their landscape for thousands of years and have been thorough. Roman roads crisscross the continent and Britain, with many still in use. Other road systems were built during the days of the Holy Roman Empire. Canal systems were dug for hauling heavy loads during the Middle Ages and beyond. When the Industrial Revolution came along, railroads sprang up quickly, many of them using the old Roman roadbeds that had gone into disuse. By the late 19th century, you could walk, ride a horse, or a train to just about anywhere, and regular ferry service kept things moving across the English Channel. Two other things evolved at this time which made the need for a car just about non-existent: the development of city public transportation and the bicycle. Major cities like Paris, London, Berlin, and the like had, by this time, put together various buses, trams, and trolleys on regular routes within city limits. Some of these were on rails, some were electric, some were steam-powered, and others were a few that were horse-drawn. Whatever the motive means, the concept was simple. Toss a coin into the basket and ride where you need to go. At the same time, the bicycle industry was exploding all across Europe. Bikes of all kinds of crazy designs were all over the roads. With such a well-developed road system, bicycles could be used for significant road trips going city to city. Indeed, bike racing is older than car racing as people set up their tours and events. So a common man of Europe in, say, 1900 could walk, ride a horse, or bike to work. For a day trip out of town, he could take a train and even take his bike with him. If he was feeling lazy that day, he could just get on the trolley, get to work, and afterwards, trolley to the next pub. Hey, life was good. Of course, lords and ladies don't use public transportation. Some did use bicycles for the sport of it, and they already own their own carriages and coaches, so making the leap from carriage to car should be much easier for them. However, the late Victorian upper crust society had specific tastes, and science was one of them. Scientific exploration, discovery, and invention was all the rage to discuss when attending a court dinner party. But it takes money to fund the expeditions, build the laboratories, and develop the new tools of invention. So if high society wants to have things to talk about at their social events, they will need to patronize these new emerging sciences. Now, it is true that in today's modern world, technology is cheap, while labor is expensive. The opposite was true in the Victorian era. Labor could be had for next to nothing, but technology required incredible investments into sciences that were just emerging and still greatly unknown. The automobile, as an invention, was cutting-edge, state-of-the-art technology, and yet was in its infancy. For the European elite, it was an opportunity for upmanship at the next bowl game to own and show to their friends just how incredible their new car is. Keep in mind that each component of a car was experimental at this time. The wheels, tires, brakes, engines, and various engine components, suspension, even how to style a car was quite up for grabs. There are dozens of different new and exciting technologies and inventions that make up these new-fangled automobiles, and many members of old money families began to patronize the industry. Also, there were those families and persons that had accumulated considerable wealth through various opportunities and businesses that had arose during the Industrial Revolution. Although many were not noble, they had money and were also working their way into the ranks of the affluent. Additionally, these people tended to have some experience in manufacturing that would be transferable to the car industry. In simplest terms, the money in Europe that funded the early development of the European car industry demanded that European cars develop and use the latest and greatest technology possible. Nobles would fund and sometimes even establish themselves a company and staff it with the talent needed to produce a car their peers would appreciate and buy. The business moguls did much of the same, though tended to start their own car companies. But inventing the technologies is expensive, and once the cars were available, money had to be made as well. Either the car was a handmade spectacle and very costly thing to develop. In order for the investors to even start to make their money back, Victorian cars of Europe were very expensive. Even the most simple of designs could cost as much as 3 years of a worker's wages. And the big, super fancy cars would take the wages of 10 men 3 or more years. And so, the car manufacturers of Victorian Europe did what anyone in business would do. Built cars that their customers wanted. And boy, did they have some customers. Many members of the European autocracy jumped into the driver's seat with enthusiasm, and indeed, some would themselves become automotive legends. But let's get this one out of the way. It is true that Queen Victoria had more makes and models of cars named after her than any other person in history. However, she never owned a car, she never drove a car, she never rode in a car. She hated the things. So when it comes to automotive heroics, the car is cross with Victoria. But anyway, with no further ado, let's look at Europe's Victorian era motoring monarchs. Okay. He wasn't actually King of England in the Victorian era, but Edward, Prince of Wales, is the man that first brought cars into the stables of Buckingham Palace. And his choice was British Daimler. He purchased the first car for the British royal family in 1900, and when he ascended to the throne in 1902, was an enthusiastic supporter of England's automotive industry, granting British Daimler to be the first car manufacturer to receive a royal warrant. One of Queen Victoria's grandsons, Prince Henry of Prussia, supported not only many car races and rallies, but also helped finance some important makes of cars, most notably the firm Nesselstoerfer. The good prince had an 1898 model in his stable, and it was one of the first cars that was designed by a man that would become a giant in the automotive world, Hans Ledwinka. oldest of Victoria's grandsons, he patronized both the Benz and Daimler brands in Germany, though after the turn of the century he turned to Mercedes. He did offer some support to other emerging German manufacturers, though he focused more on military applications. Whatever your opinion may be of this particular Belgian king, he certainly was quite the proponent of automobilism. Any kind of industrial industry he was all over, and cars were no exception. Many great makes of Belgian cars began during his reign, Metallurgique, Deschamps, Germain, some of which would become part of the great Belgian cars of the Edwardian era. Leopold ensured that both legislation and, if needed, funding would be available for his nation's emerging car industry. Oh, the Tsars of Russia have had a long passion for cars. Nicholas's grandfather, Alexander II, had actually bought a car in 1862. Well, kinda. An inventor in France, Monsieur Etienne Lenoir, had built a wagon with an engine on it that kinda worked. Grandpappy Alex saw it and bought the thing, and it was still in Moscow during Nicholas's reign. Although he never established a Russian car company himself, during the Victorian era he was quite keen on French cars, having a de Dion Bouton, a Panhard and Levasseur, and two Peugeots at the Tsar's court stables. Best known for being assassinated in 1914, which ignited the First World War, and yes, he was riding his own Grafenstieft at the time, his patronage of the Austrian automobile industry goes back much further and deeper. In the 1890s, our car-friendly Duke backed the establishment of a new car manufacturer in Austria. This company would become Lohner. What is particularly significant about this is that, like his friend, Prince Henry of Prussia, Freddie found the absolute best engineer he could find to invent his cars. And you may have heard of this young inventive engineer, Ferdinand Porsche. Yes, it's true that Alfonso didn't actually start ruling as king until 1902. But that's just because he was literally born king. His father died before his birth. It doesn't get more born in the purple than that. And never before or since had a ruler of a nation been a car guy like Lucky Al. He was absolutely fascinated with cars from a few years of age. By the time he was 12 years old, he'd already driven some of the early Benz cars, and well before his 16th birthday, already owned a Serpollet, a couple of Panhard and Levasseurs, and had driven just about anything he can get his hands on. He liked his cars to have lots of power and to go fast, and his taste in cars began to not only drive his own nation, but influence others as well. Like car guys of today, Lucky Al the King was all into what his cars could do, how they looked, and how they could be modified to be even more to his liking. He started to personally sponsor races and rallies. He would even drive his cars in races and rallies. He would drive his own car on the roads of Spain, and after dealing with whatever he encountered, would demand legislation for road control and safety, having his own experience to help guide the lawmaking. During his reign in the 20th century, this king would be either directly or indirectly responsible for some of the greatest cars ever built. And we will hear much more about him, I can assure you. Now, I have heard some automotive historians comment that European car development was hindered by the fact that it was driven by the nobility. I obviously largely disagree with this. I believe that the record shows otherwise. The technology that made cars common had to come from somewhere, and it came from the Victorian era, at a time when the common man could not pay for it. Yet, the motoring monarchs of the 19th century paid the automotive development bill so that in the future, cars could be made for the common man. Thanks for watching Vintage Car History. We'll see you next week. Peace.